Welcome, everyone, to the Road to Emmaus podcast. We're so happy and thankful that you guys decided to join us today as we embark on this journey, just, talk about the Bible and really just explore Christianity and all that it has to offer. And yeah, we're just excited to have you with us. So before we get started, given that it's our first ever podcast, we kind of want to introduce ourselves and just talk about, who we are and kind of why we decided to do this.
Guys, my dog interrupted our podcast.
So as you can see, anything can kind of happen, but yeah, where were we? Oh, right, intros. So I guess let's introduce ourselves, talk a little bit about who we are, what our background looks like, and kind of why I want to do this podcast. So my name is Kevin. I graduated from college 2 years ago now, which is kind of crazy to say out loud, but yeah, I'm working, and when I was in college, I actually grew up in the church, so I had two God-fearing parents, thankfully, and so I was able to, go to the church a lot when I was a kid and be involved in the youth group and other things like that. So I kind of had that Christian background growing up. But then when I got into college, I joined my own fellowship and eventually became a leader there. So that was kind of interesting, where I was able to not only grow myself spiritually and work on that, but also help others with their own spiritual development. And that was also something that was really important to me. And so when thinking about this idea of doing this podcast, it kind of made sense in a way that we can kind of talk about the issues that we are all experiencing and as well share a biblical light on it, but also just have it someplace where others can see it and others can kind of understand that, some of the things that they're going through are not unique to them and that it's something that we all go through. And so I felt like it would be something really interesting to talk about. And that's kind of why this was here. So yeah, that's me.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jonathan Marigala. I graduated from college recently, and I've pretty much been in the church my entire life. I grew up with a Christian background, and currently I lead worship and teach Sunday school at my family's church, Grace Gospel Church, and I've been doing that for about 10 years. Definitely being a part of that church has helped me grow as a believer, experience different things, experience phases of growth that has allowed me to, increase my knowledge base, allow me to interact with other people, and so on and so forth. And, whether it's just talking to my parents about the Bible or talking to these two about the Bible or anyone else, I always am intrigued. I feel like it's engaging. And I know that every time I do have a conversation with someone, I feel like I'm learning something and that it's something that I can apply to my life, because that's essentially what's important, right? Because Jesus said very clearly, let's not just be hearers of the word, but also be doers as well. So it's important to not only hear what pastors, youth leaders have to say, but also do research ourselves and try to figure out and analyze the truth that God has in His Word. So that's about me.
What's up, guys? My name is Jeffrey, and I graduated college with Kevin 2 years ago, and I did computer engineering, and then just working. And I'm also a part-time seminary student. I feel like that's something God's called me to. Maybe we could talk about that later, because it kind of pertains to what we're talking about today. But yeah, I mean, these two kind of asked me to be on the podcast to co-host with them. So I'm excited to see where God's going to take this.
Amen. So that's just a little bit about us. And I know before we get into it, we also just kind of want to talk about where the idea or the name of the podcast came from. Because I know the Road to Emmaus is not something that I guess is a particularly well-known story, or it's not something that most people think of when they think of notable events in the Bible. But it's something that we felt was really interesting. And, after talking about it, it had a lot of connection to why we wanted to do the podcast. So I think that that's something that we kind of wanted to explain to you guys, just to see the vision of what we're going for here. So, any of you guys want to talk about it?
You want to take it?
Sure. So, especially when we were talking about this podcast, we wanted to think about a name that would be suited for our vision, for the objective that we're trying to achieve here. And, when you think about the road to Emmaus, obviously it's a story about two disciples that were walking with the newly risen Christ, but when they were talking with him and going to Emmaus, which was their destination. They didn't recognize him. They didn't understand who he was. They were also confused and perplexed. They were saying, "Well, how do you not know about Jesus Christ being crucified? How do you not know that the temple tore in two? How do you not know that all these events took place?" Because Jesus at the time, it seemed to them that he was clueless about everything that was going on. But then, as he broke bread, as he talked to them about the many different experiences that he had, the revelations of the kingdom of God, their eyes were opened. And that's essentially what we want to do in this podcast. We want to open the eyes of anyone who is trying to seek truth, because I can speak for all three of us that, we've all had our own personal journeys, and we've been able to grow as believers through thick and thin, through trials and tribulations. And every single time that we go through something, we gain truth. We're able to understand it, and we're able to apply it. And I feel like, especially in our present generation, many people are unwilling to take the time to do their own research, and either want to rely on their parents to make them a Christian. They want to just go to church and just force the environment to make them a better believer, but that's not how things work. But rather, if you do have a passion and a longing to serve God, then ultimately it's that desire that's going to reward you and drive you to pursue truth. And I really hope that, even all our viewers, that they are inspired just like all of us to, find your calling, trust God for that understanding that you might be lacking, and just trust in Him to take you to the next stage of your spiritual walk. So
Yeah, and one thing that I really love about that story is that Jesus had just died, right, in Jerusalem, and they're on their way to Jerusalem, like from Jerusalem to Emmaus. And when Jesus meets them, they're still downcast about everything that happened,
right,
and they kind of tell Jesus the retelling of like what had happened, right, just like you said. But if you look at how they tell it, they say, "Oh yeah, like we were told that Jesus would be resurrected, but at least that's what the women told us. But when they went there, they couldn't find his body. Then the disciples went there, and they still couldn't find Jesus. Like the tomb was empty, and they kind of like took those signs of the tomb being empty and the body not being there as signs that Jesus had not returned, whereas the disciples probably took it as a sign of confusion, but they at least were kind of leaning towards, okay, maybe he is alive. There was like that hope. But these disciples in Emmaus, they spent time with Jesus in Jerusalem. But then when things didn't go exactly how they imagined their version of Jesus to, kind of take place, then they started leaving, right?
that's a good point.
And then Jesus meets them on their way to the journey. So I feel like for a lot of us, we're all on a journey somewhere where we've met Jesus and we've seen things that should have prompted us towards Jesus, but instead it's kind of like taking us away from Jesus. And we're on that journey of returning back to him, because the story ends with, once they realize who they have been talking to
Right,
the whole time, they return back to Jerusalem.
right,
Right. And for me, kind of metaphorically, it's like we're returning back to the heart of the Father, which is to know Jesus. And all that kind of took place and was centered around the events that transpired in Jerusalem. Right. Like if we had known Jesus's heart, we would have known that it was his purpose to serve us in his death and not to reign victorious over the Roman Empire as the disciples had once thought.
that's true.
Right. And so I feel like for a lot of our viewers, and even for us, as we discuss and wrestle with things, that's kind of like the purpose of the podcast, that we're supposed to discuss and wrestle with things so that we get a fresh vision of what Jesus is doing and what God's doing in our lives and who he is to us.
So I'm just curious, based off what you said. So why do you think, like when you mentioned that the disciples, it's something that they should, I guess, the events that they should like lead them towards the believing of Christ or believing that he's resurrected, but it just ended up not doing that. So why do you think that kind of happened then? And then how do you think that kind of relates to us today as like young believers, when there should be things that point towards God, the events in our life that should say, okay, like we know that God is here, we know that God did this, but sometimes we just look the other direction, or we just think that it doesn't. So why do you think that is?
Well, I think like one, life is just hard in general, right? Like this isn't something that people are supposed to do easily, right? I think the disciples, Jesus told them that, hey, I'm supposed to die, right? We have that in the Gospels, but even when Jesus dies, they're still not prepared for it, right? They're all heartbroken because their hearts were set on a Messiah that would be victorious. And dying on a cross to people who were, pagan, not Jewish, and even the Jewish leaders had crucified him,
Mhm.
right? So that image and that, like, how the events transpired, it must have been heartbreaking for the disciples. But I think the problem was that, they weren't real, like, their vision obviously wasn't correct, right? Because it's such a hard thing to grasp. But the good news is that we have a God who journeys with us, right? Even when we take a dive and when we go hit our low points, it's not that God is standing above our low points and is saying, "Come to me." He actually comes in and journeys with you up to back to those high points. And every
Mm.
time we experience a low point, again, He's there with us to make sure that we can travel up to those high points that we're coveting in our lives, right? So I think that's like the grander story of what the gospel really is. It's about a God who comes for us, and He doesn't really like leave us to figure it out on our own. Instead, He comes to rescue us and takes us on this journey with Him.
Mm. You have anything you want to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, the thing is, like, brings up a good point because many times, when people think of Christ and they think of Jesus, they have like a certain vision of him,
Hmm.
and they want Jesus to suit their timetable and suit their expectations, but when really that's not the case. And I feel like the disciples in Emmaus, they had a lot of presuppositions holding them back because they,
Mhm.
as Jeff said, like they thought this Messiah would be some sort of conqueror to take them away from the Romans, but obviously that didn't end up being the case because Jesus was here to deliver us from something greater than that, right?
Mhm.
But then when they realized that Jesus was speaking to them in a completely different way, they understood the fresh perspective and they were grateful for it. And I feel like many times we put God within these certain parameters and we expect him to answer our every prayer request, to not let us deal with pain, to not let us deal with fear, that we don't allow him to truly allow to we don't allow him to um change our hearts so that we can grow.
Hmm.
And because so people are so stubborn in the sense that, like, God didn't answer my request this time. He clearly doesn't care about me. He has abandoned me. He has forsaken me. But, if you take a step back and you humbly say, God, whatever form you take, whatever way you speak to me, whatever way you communicate to me, let my heart be receptive to it.
Mhm.
Let me have the faith to trust in you and say, God, even though I don't understand what you're doing right now, there is a purpose behind it, and I want to see it through. And I feel like if the church was like that nowadays, the people of God would be able to progress at an exponential rate. But because people are so stuck and restricted by either what other people think, by other people's expectations, that they don't want to take the time to, you know, um, help their own journey and just progress as a believer. So it's important for all of us, even for us three and to the viewers, that don't always be open minded when it comes to Christ, because Christ, he knows your situation better than anyone else. So don't expect him to abandon you, because he won't, and don't think that he doesn't know what you're going through, because he does. But rather just listen to his voice. I mean, David says it in Psalms many times. I wait for the Lord and I listen to his voice. So listen to his voice, see what he's trying to tell you, and see the message that he's trying to convey. And you will grow from it. You will be happier. You will be joyous, and you will experience a peace, as the Bible says, that surpasses all understanding. So, yeah.
Yeah. I'm actually glad that you phrased it that way because it kind of segues into our main topic for this podcast, which is just how to hear God's voice and how to know what He's saying to you and how to really listen for that. And I know that that's such a struggle for a lot of people because sometimes we may think that something that we're hearing is from God, or rather, it might be something that we want to hear, a thought we're putting in our own head. So the ability to discern whether or not something that we're hearing is from of God or from someone else is something that not a lot of people have and are looking to try to find. And I know personally myself, it's interesting because you were talking about how we'd restrict our mind to not hear the things of God sometimes. I remember when I was looking for that, I would pray that God would speak to me, in dreams, because that's how I felt like God was speaking to me originally. But I realized that in doing that, it restricted just what God was able to do, and like all the other different ways that God was able to speak to me, whether it was through a sermon, whether it was through people, whether it was through anything else. And so, I had to learn that and fix that when my own prayer life, just to understand, like, like as cool as that would be, ultimately God works in so many different ways. So why am I trying to restrict him to one thing?
Mm.
And so, yeah, that being said, I know, like, since Jeff, you're in seminary school, and you've had Jonathan, you've had 10 years in the ministry, you guys have definitely had to look for God's calling to speak to you, and like decisions to make or things that you've had to do. So I was gonna ask, what, like, how do you guys like discern God's voice from your own? How do you guys verify that, and what do you really do with that going forward?
Well, I think like before like we talk about discernment and like or we wrestle with discernment, right? I think it's important to first acknowledge that God's speaking,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because there's a lot of people, and me, it's myself included, because who feel that God doesn't speak, right? There are times where, and there are going to be seasons where God's going to be abnormally quiet, right? And there are going to be seasons where God's speaking to you like that. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's going to be immediate and it's going to be frequent. And then there are going to be seasons. Most seasons are going to be accompanied with God,
Mm-hmm.
speaking at a pace that everyone's kind of comfortable with, uniquely, right? Everyone has their own pace of how they hear God, because God has different purposes for everybody, right? And so there may be some people who may feel that God's not speaking to them, and in our minds we'll attach it to certain reasons,
Mm-hmm.
right? Like, this is what happened with Job, right? Job suffers, and his friends come along and say, maybe it's because there's a sin in your life that you haven't confronted yet,
Mm-hmm.
right? And maybe it's X, Y, and Z. And maybe our viewers are saying, maybe I'm just unworthy to be spoken to by God,
Mm.
right? Or maybe I'm just not surrounded by the right people, or if I'm not surrounded by the right church community, or whatever the excuse is, right? But it's important to note that God is always speaking. Now, whether or not we're able to listen is the question,
Mm-hmm.
right?
That's
Like,
true.
we have to be able to listen to God's voice, right? The Bible never talks about or never asks, right? God, start speaking to me. It says God speak to me because our souls are longing for that. But it never says God start speaking to me, right? It says God speak to me, and it's really a cry for our soul to listen to what God is already saying to us, right? And so a lot of times we are surrounded by so much noise. Like, the first step, if we want to really hear God's voice, is to be intentional and quiet the noise around us,
Mm.
right? I was watching, I think it was like a sermon by Mike Todd like a while ago, and I think he was just like talking about like how God speaks. He's like going through all the different ways, right? Like, God can speak to us through different people. God can speak to us through dreams and visions,
Mm-hmm.
miracles, coincidences was one, um, and there were like a couple others. But then he started talking about, we can have experience all of these in our lives. Like, you can experience a miracle, and it could have no edifying factor to you if you're not willing to listen,
Mm-hmm.
Wow.
right?
Yeah.
And he was saying how we need to take the time to listen to God, and what that practically looks like. And one of my professors had talked about this. Like, you have to like really distance yourself from the world to listen to God, right? Because God speaks in whispers, right? You can't amplify a whisper,
Yeah.
otherwise it turns into a shout.
Mm-hmm.
And God doesn't really shout at people unless that's what He wants to do. But most of the times it's a whisper, right? The only way you can hear a whisper is if you silence the background noise,
Mm.
right?
That's
So
true.
that means you have to pull yourself out of your social circle. You have to make time, like cut out 30 minutes or like an hour of your day and just sit in silence. Like, put your phone somewhere else, right? Turn off all the electronics and whatnot.
Right.
And I'm sounding like the typical Indian parent here, right? But like, it's true. Like, you have to do that and spend time with God to really hear His voice,
Yeah.
right? And so I think that's like the first step. Um, and then once you start hearing God's voice, right? one, God's going to confirm things for you, right? Um, and two, if you really want to discern whether or not something immediately is from God, compare it to His Word, right? Is one, and then compare it also to your calling,
Hmm.
because whatever He tells you is always going to contribute to your calling,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
right? If like you're going to be handed opportunities to do things, even in ministry, like we'll be handed opportunities like, hey, do you want to do X, Y, and Z for us? And maybe your calling is not to serve there, right?
Hmm.
But it could be a great opportunity. Doesn't really matter,
Yeah.
right? God has a specific calling for you. And it's not that you can't go and do that. It's just that when you go and do that, God's probably not going to sustain you as much as He would have if you had accepted an opportunity that was in line with the calling He has for your life,
Hmm.
True.
right? And so I think that's an important part of understanding the discernment. It's about knowing God's word and making sure it aligns with God's word morally, right? And two, making sure it aligns with your purpose.
Yeah, I mean, Jeff brought up a good point because, we're supposed to have a relationship with God, right? And you never really see a relationship be one-sided, especially the ones that are, long lasting. There's always a give and take.
Mm-hmm.
And, I know people in my church that, they do the conventional Christian things. They tithe, they sing the songs, they, dress nice, they do the long prayers in order to promote themselves, whatever. But there are some people that, I can just tell from their actions um, by how they conduct themselves that they want everything spiritually handed to them.
Hmm.
And whether it's their whether it's their attitude or whatever it may be, but sometimes these people, they say things like, God, give me spiritual growth. God, I want more spiritual growth this year. But the thing is, none of their actions change.
Hmm.
They don't change anything about their behaviors. They don't seek to be better as a believer. As Jeff said, they don't take the time to drown out the noise and just hear His voice. And it's important because everybody thinks that in order to fit God into my schedule, I can do everything else in life and I can still have God and everything will work out. But with a relationship with God, there always has to be sacrifice. Just like, God sacrificed for you, the least that we can do is sacrifice even a little bit of your time to listen to His voice.
Mm-hmm.
And it's
Hmm.
people that can come into the presence of God humbly, that God can truly do amazing things in your life. Because I've heard someone say this, even if you were to spend 20 years getting to a certain place in your life, God can do it in 5. God can do it in
Right.
1 year if He wanted to. He can open doors where things may seem impossible to man, but He can make it possible because He's God.
Mm.
And the thing is, there are so many people that are willing to work those 20 years because, one, their pride is just obstructing them and they choose not to, accept God's plan and His terms, and
Mm-hmm.
instead choose to do things according to their own intelligence, which we all know never ends well.
Mhm.
But you know, it's when you have the discernment to listen for God's voice that you can truly see His plan, your plan. I mean, His plan for your life. I mean, that's why, Jeremiah 29:11. We all know that verse. That God has plans to prosper us, not to harm us. And every time we go through a tough situation in our life, we might think that God is punishing me. God is trying to God is abandoning me, whatever it may be. But every single step of your journey, you have to put in that effort. And whether it's drowning out the noise, whether it's seeking His presence and just letting go of all the outwardly influences, that is when God can truly make a difference in your life and in the lives of other believers. Because obviously, there's that phrase, actions speak louder than words. And many times in the church, there are Christians that are rather lukewarm, and they will just go through the motions, never really put any passion into their spiritual journey. But it's the people that don't care about doing the necessary Christian things that ultimately make the biggest impact in the lives of others, because they can see, like, okay, this person's joy is something different. They're happy even though they're suffering and going through so much worse than I am. They're happy.
Mm.
They're enjoying God's presence. Why am I not having that? I have
Mhm.
everything. I have a house, I have a family, I have, my salaries is huge, whatever it may be. But still,
I wish.
Yeah, I wish.
I know. But, even with all these amazing, perfect things, they still feel empty because they're not leaving room for God to truly change them.
Mm.
So, if more people did that, especially upcoming youth as well, because the world is constantly like trying to put them in this space where they want to instill this mindset. Everything's about you. Worry about your own, desires, worry about your own ambitions. There's no need for a God. You shouldn't care about anyone else. But it's the upcoming youth. If they adopt this mentality, this mindset, they will change the face of Christianity in the long run. And many people, after seeing what they have done with their lives, they will come to Jesus in herds. And I believe that strongly, that since the end times is coming, that's definitely going to be the case. So, yeah.
Yeah, and I think like something you touched on was like repeating lessons,
Yes.
right? Like the idea of like if you're not learning what God is trying to teach you in the season continues,
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
right? You see that with the Old Testament, the Israelites, they're wandering in the desert, and God essentially waits in the desert with the Israelites until that generation who had complained about their situation
Right.
had died off, right? And God gives a promise instead to this new generation that has come up, right? And I think for a lot of us, like we're so focused on the outcome of our situation as opposed to the condition of our hearts, right?
Wow.
Like I
Mm.
remember like when applying for jobs, like dude, you're not unemployed because you're not qualified. Like God can get you any job you want or any job he wants
Mm-hmm.
without the necessary qualifications. Like qualifications is
Yeah.
not a factor, right? It's more about you're not getting the job because you're still seeing the job as your source of income,
Yeah.
right? Your source of sustainability.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
When in fact, it's supposed to be God that sustains you, and you're supposed to identify God as the person who sustains you and who carries you through and provides for
Right.
you, right? Even that job is not something that provides for you.
Mm-hmm.
That's God using that job to provide something for you to accomplish his purpose,
Right.
Yeah.
right? But the moment we see the job as the thing that is to be held onto,
Right.
then God teaches us we need to let go of the job. And how does he teach us to let go of the job? Right? He takes us out of it,
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
right? And so that's something that a lot of people, they know in their head, but they don't like understand with their soul,
Mm.
right? And you kind of have to like live through it to like really understand it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
I'm glad you brought that up because I kind of have a story that fits exactly that, like personally, in this past year. So when I graduated undergrad, I was looking for a job for a while, and I just could not find any interviews, or even if I did, like something would happen to where I wouldn't end up getting any position. And so I was really, praying to God. I was really trying to see, like, God, where do you want me to go? What do you want me to do? Do you want me to, go back to school? Do you want me to do anything else? Like, what is your plan for me here? And I remember, it was very interesting because I ended up looking for temp jobs just on a whim because I figured at that point, I should just get into the workforce, try to do something. And so I got an interview for a temp job. And so I applied, I did the interview and said everything went great, but like, we'll give you the offer for a week. So I had the time to really decide. But then I got another job or a temp offer. And this was for a company that I wanted to work for like ever since like sophomore year of undergrad. Like, this is like the company I wanted to work for. But the day of the interview was on the day I was supposed to accept the offer. So I didn't think anything of it. I was like, okay, I'll do the interview, but if nothing happens, it's fine. At least I have something. And then I did the interview on that day, and within 30 minutes, I got the offer. And to me,
Wow.
like, I don't like to accept things like with having no notice, but I felt like God was instantly saying, like, I think you're ready now. Here's the offer you wanted. Take the job. And so I took the temp job, worked for a couple months, and then I got the full time offer. And now I'm full time at this position and still at this company to this day. And so I think it was just interesting because I remember not knowing where I was going or what was going to happen in my life. And I think that was just a time where God was like saying like, listen, like I know like that you're looking for this job. I know that this is what you want, but just like learn to trust me for a couple months. Really spend time with me and like just let me handle everything, and you
Mm-hmm.
can just let go of that. And then I feel like I'm still working on it, but once I was able to do that, that's when God took over and said, "Okay, here's what
Yeah.
I've got for you." And He came through like always.
Yeah, and that's something that like a lot of people would chalk up to like a coincidence.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like you'll say, "Oh, that's nice that it worked out for you." Like that's a coincidence, and they'll say, they're happy for you and whatever. But like when you're a Christian, there's no such thing as coincidences. Like things
Mm-hmm.
happen for a reason, and um, like even now, dude, like that job is probably something that's going to contribute to your calling as a person in the kingdom,
Mm.
right? Like you may not know like what that calling is, but
Yeah.
that is something that's going to help contribute to you accomplishing that goal
Yeah.
that God has for you, you know?
Yeah. I think it's interesting because I understand what you mean with coincidences because I have another story kind of similar to that where something that happened that may seem like a coincidence, but to me in that moment I just thought like instantly that that's God. That's God working right there. And I think that, like for our viewers or really anyone else that go through similar situations, I think if you see something where you think it may be a coincidence or it may be God, but you're not sure, just go to the word, start praying to him, just start looking for, you know, start like really just spending time with him and he'll reveal that to you. And like I think one thing that I remember when I was like looking into, how do you really hear from God is just like if it's of God and it's rooted in scripture, it's something that he'll say over and over and over to you again, just to reinforce the idea to you. And that
Mm-hmm.
way it's not something that's from yourself, but it's from God because, he wants you to know that and it's like bound by scripture. And so in my case, I had a story where I was in the city and I was just, New York City, and I wasn't feeling too great. I was like kind of feeling a little bit lonely. And as you're walking around, a little girl came up to me just to say hi, and then she walked away. But in that moment, I wasn't even thinking about God, and I was just lonely and just like feeling in my emotions. But that moment there, it was just like, okay, that's God. That's God telling me right there, like you're not alone. Like I'm still with you. I'm still watching you. Like you don't have to worry about it. And I almost like I got really emotional just thinking about it. And so I think that like those moments could be considered coincidences, but like you just said, it's like it's not like that's definitely God right there. That's definitely God interfering in our lives.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think like a big part of it is also being aware, right? Like you have to be aware at all times that God could be speaking to you,
Mm.
and that you shouldn't like push away any emotion that you're feeling. But if you feel like once you start maturing in your faith, you'll start to like understand and start to like realize, right, that certain emotions, they don't just come up from the heart.
Mm.
And certain ideas don't just pop into your head, right? Like is the one who like gives you those emotions. God's the one who gives you those ideas. Um and so you kind of have to act on it in immediate obedience. I have I went to a college club's testimony night I think last year. And in the testimony night, like, testimony nights are always awkward, right? Like
Yeah.
the first 5 minutes is like pure silence.
Yeah.
You can hear a pin drop, and then the flood the floodwaters just break open, and like
That's
there's
true.
like 10
Yeah.
people in line, and because they all think God has done something good for them,
Yeah.
and so they want to say something about it, which is cool. And I think we're like about like 7 or 8 people in maybe,
Yeah.
and you have those testimonies which are like there's always that pressure to like
Right.
come up with the best testimony ever, right?
Mm.
Like, oh, God saved me from drugs, and then he saved me from alcohol, and then he saved my whole family from drugs and alcohol. It's like, dude, like calm down.
Yeah.
Like it's okay. Like it's not a contest.
Yeah.
But then we had a kid. He came up to, or before the kid came up, right? There's this awkward silence, right?
As it usually is.
And the leaders of the club were thinking of ending the testimony period and going into worship. And I just felt something in my heart, God saying there's one more. That's
Mm.
all he said.
Mm.
Didn't know what the testimony was. And I didn't know how the night would go after that one testimony. So I called up, there's someone in the back with me who's on leadership. And I told him, tell them to wait.
Mm.
Like tell the leaders to wait. And I was like, this is crazy. Like, I've never done anything like this,
Yeah.
but I just felt it strongly. So I was like, you know what? If I don't obey, then what kind of a Christian am I really,
Mm.
right?
Right.
And so we told them to wait, and then they waited. I think maybe like 2 minutes. So awkward because there's just music playing. Everyone's looking around,
Mm.
and then this kid just walks up, and he starts talking about how he had self-image issues,
Mm.
right?
Oh man.
And then the kid he starts breaking down on stage,
Mm.
and he's like, I was about to kill myself,
Mm.
right? And God saved me. And then that's like the high pressure testimony that everyone's going after, right? And then even after that testimony, we had a couple more,
Mm.
right? So it wasn't like there was one more, but I think that was the one that God wanted the kids to hear.
Mm.
And even when God's speaking to us, there's always that pressure of, okay, if I obey on this, I better see a really big result.
Yeah.
Right.
I better see a really big outcome, right?
Yeah.
And it's okay. Like, even if the kid that gave a testimony after I told the leadership to, like, hey, let's wait for a bit, even if nobody went up, that's
Mm.
okay,
Yeah.
right? Because you don't know the purpose for why God has told you to
Yeah.
wait,
Mm.
right? At least for mine, he was specific. He was like, there's one more. But what if he had just said wait?
Mm.
If he had just said wait, then it could have been for a number of reasons. Maybe he just wanted
Right.
a kid to sit in the testimony
Yeah.
that was just said, to just sit in that
Yeah.
word that was just given. And maybe his soul really needed that.
Mm.
And moving into worship so fast would have been the wrong decision, right?
Yeah.
Maybe God just wanted that. Maybe if the testimony wasn't as big as, oh, I was going to kill myself, but then God changed it. God changed the circumstance. Maybe it was, hey, I was stressed out about a test and I got a C.
Mm.
I passed the class.
Yeah.
Like, maybe that's what someone else in the audience was going through,
Mm-hmm.
Mm.
Right.
right? And I would have been like, God, you told me to wait for that, but you never know, dude, right? And so I think a big part of how you said about your job, like accepting it, just getting an offer in 30 minutes and then accepting it,
Mhm.
right? Recognizing the kid as someone that God had sent to uplift your spirit, right?
Mm.
That's all acts of obedience, right?
Yeah.
And you need to be aware in your life of how God is moving and how God can move in order to really act in obedience when it comes to those kind of opportunities, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think the self-awareness is just super important
Right.
when discerning God's voice, when wanting to listen to God's voice. That's a big part of it.
Mm.
No, the thing is we should never restrict God into our certain vision of how we want to be communicated. And the thing is God can use anything to change a person's heart. And what you both said clearly reflects that, whether it's passing a test or not killing yourself, everything are steps on your path to becoming a better believer. Personally in my life, I feel like God has spoken to me the most through my church, and mostly because I've been part of my church for so long, and it has not been a smooth ride, not in the in the least. And even to this day, recently we celebrated our 10th year anniversary, and even though it's been 10 years, we still deal with struggles every single week. But the thing I've learned is God is able to move through the lives of the families that I'm serving, that my
Mhm.
family is serving, that that we're talking to, the friendships that I've made, the different perspectives that I've come to understand, seeing that even in the midst of this, God is there, God is present. When it came to my church, we weren't in one place for all these 10 years, but we've moved to 4 different spots because of the circumstances, because of how things turned out. And even during those transitional periods, it was very difficult for my family. to buy equipment, to learn a bunch of things quickly, and to be able to do what God called us to do. And many times we did not have the manpower to do a lot of the stuff that we did. And there were some times where we didn't have families to depend on because of people not being committal, or just people choosing to desert us and going to a better church. But we stood firm, and I realized that, even in the impossible situations, God can make a difference. And even in my life, when I've, tried to think to myself, and I've thought like God, like, why am I going through this? Like, I thought, like, my family and I are doing what you called us to do. Why does it seem like we're progressing backwards? Why does it seem like things are not going the way I wanted to? And why are we still struggling with problems that we've been dealing with for the past, 7, 8 years? And God is trying to say, like, there's a lesson to this, and I'm trying to build strength in you. And God is a type of God that does not give us anything that we cannot handle, right? So I always think of it like that. If God is making you suffer, and He's allowing you to suffer, and you're going through something in life, that another way of saying that is God thinks that you're strong enough to handle it. He doesn't think you're weak. If he thought you were weak, He would have never let that happen in the first place. But if you're going through something so overwhelming, and you feel like it's the end of the line, that you have no hope, that there's no joy, that it's impossible to overcome it, God thinks you can. And that's why He put you through this situation. So, you know, think about it and understand that God, is doing what is best for you. And even when it is difficult temporarily, it is the eternal value that we seek after, you know. Um and if God is going putting you through a situation, depend on Him, because it is you, after the trial and tribulation happens, that is going to say, I thank God for allowing me to go through this. I thank God that that certain people deserted me. I thank God that I had to wait extra time, because it is the lessons that you've learned that is invaluable to a Christian life, and it's those lessons that will, make you stronger, and will help others that might have similar problems. So God's voice ultimately is so important, because it is the gateway to a person's growth. And unless you are willing to accept all these different ways that God can communicate to you, and see how He moves, see how He has communicated to you so far, how He's delivered you from certain things, then, you can say, like, God, all this time I've doubted you,
Mm-hmm.
but you've never left me. You've never forsaken me. So why do I choose to doubt you, God? And give me that strength. And that's ultimately inspiring to people, even, newly believers, even believers that have been followers of Christ for very long. They struggle with that. They struggle with depending on God, trying to understand God from a different perspective. And if you can do that, then you will help many people around you and become a vessel to be used for His kingdom. So,
Yeah, and I think like you when you said, like, God gives you stuff that you can handle. Like, I view it a little differently. Like, even if there are things that God gives us that I can't handle, right? I think that's because God wants you to understand that you by yourself are not strong enough to handle it, right? Our dog is interrupting us again. But that's okay. Like, if you by yourself, right, can't handle it, then that's all right,
yeah.
because you got God, right? Um, when you can't handle it, that's how you grow,
Right.
right? Like, if you're in the weight room and you're trying to lift something that once you couldn't lift, right? It's only when you push yourself to failure that you're gonna experience growth,
That is true.
right? Like, if you're stuck at 30 pounds lifting whatever, right? And you go till failure, right? The next week you come back, you might get you're probably gonna get an extra rep or two in, right? Now you're not gonna move a whole weight up,
Right.
but maybe you'll get an extra rep or two in, or maybe you will move a whole weight up. You never know, right? In the same way, like, spiritually, like, when you are in a season that you cannot handle, that's when you recognize that you need God,
That's true. Yeah.
right? And that's when you really embrace him and his favor and all the things that you need, because your soul becomes so desperate that it will resent itself and start to latch onto God.
Right.
Right. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's why humility is just so important too, just to have that, because then you're just constantly in a state of recognizing that, while all these things are maybe going right or going wrong, that just God is in control and He's always in control, and that we don't get to let ourselves become too high to where we think that we're in charge of everything, because then once something comes our way that we can't handle, we forget that God is one that's taking charge of that and really in control of all of that. So I'm really appreciative that you brought that up. So it looks like we're gonna wrap up, but is there anything last things that you want to leave with the viewers? Just anything that you feel like they may resonate with or connect with, to really just bring home the point of how to really hear from God and how to discern what is His voice versus what isn't.
So, one thing I would like to say to everyone, as someone who has been in the church for most of his life, please take your time. Don't feel pressured by the people around you. Because growing up, I have had many expectations put on me, and where I have to be at a certain stage in my life at a certain age, or I have to act a certain way, or I can't act a certain way, or whatever. And because of that, I feel like my growth as a believer was stagnant for certain periods of my life, because I was kind of like stuck in this space, this circle that was dictated by people's expectations of me. But when I decided to keep my spiritual growth private, in the sense that, like, my study with God, my prayer time, anything relating to God, I kept it to myself, because ultimately it's your relationship with God. It's not your parents' relationships, not your friends, it's you.
Yeah.
Whatever pace is comfortable with you, take it and run with it. Because none of us are the same. None of us have the same knowledge base. None of us have the same experience. But we're all learning. We're all trying to grow, and we're all trying to be better. That's ultimately it. And our goal, one of our main goals, as this podcast, Road to Emmaus, is just to inspire you to take a leap of faith. Take a leap of faith in your job, in your relationships, in your family, in your relationship with God, most importantly, and see where that takes you. Because God, He says the parable of the mustard seed for a very specific reason. It takes a very little amount of faith for God to move mountains in your life. And if you are willing to, put in that faith, block out the noise, and just say, God, use me, He'll use you. You don't have to be special. You don't need to have a degree. You don't have to have qualifications, but rather just have a heart that is willing to listen and obey. And God can use you mightily for His kingdom. So don't feel pressurized. Learn along with us. None of us are experts here. We're all learning along with you. And I really hope that whatever we say is valuable to you. You can take something from it and share it with others, and hopefully the knowledge that you get from us can help you and the people around you. So I hope you enjoy our future podcasts and continue to tune in and experience the Word of God with us. So.
Yeah, and if there's anything that you guys would love us to talk about or to discuss, you can visit our YouTube page, which we'll link below, and you guys can leave a comment. Subscribe if you want. No pressure, but that'd definitely be nice.
Yeah.
We're trying to get sponsored. No, I'm kidding. Not trying to get sponsors, but yeah. One thing to just leave with you guys. Remember, God's always trying to reach out to you guys.
That's true.
We just got to be willing to listen. So make that for the next couple of weeks your goal, to just be practical in how you set aside time throughout the day. Take some time. If you need to take a day off work, do that. I'm sure most of us won't, but I've done it a couple times. It's great. But just take some time to listen to God, and we'll see you guys at the next episode.